Hello, my name is Father Charlie Bouchard, and I'm here today to offer you a few thoughts on the readings for the 18th Sunday in Ordinary Time so that you can know more about the readings before you hear them at Mass on Sunday. You know, in most cultures, clothes are a really big thing. There used to be, well, not used to be, but there is a very old saying that went, clothes make the man. And there's a real truth to that. We look at people and we judge who they are, how much money they have, how important they are. And we see this in a lot of different places in our society. For example, if you ever watch the Academy Awards or the Emmys or the Golden Globes, you see all the potential awardees coming in with extravagant clothing. Sometimes it's glorious and beautiful, other times it's ridiculous and absurd, but clothes are a way in which people try to communicate who they are, or at least who they would like to be in their imagination. We see this in the military as well, where there's a whole code book of how people's rank is recognized. And I couldn't begin to tell you what those different signs and bars and stars and all of those things mean. But to anybody in the military, those are very important. Those various kinds of clothing immediately tell the military who this person is and how much authority they have. We also see it in the medical world, where you've got doctors who wear long white coats and doctors who wear short coats. There's a big difference between them and in how they're recognized for their expertise and for their authority. And even in the church, and perhaps I shouldn't say even, maybe especially in the church, we make extensive use of different kinds of clothing to say something about the season or about the person who is wearing the clothes, or perhaps about the way in which we understand this particular celebration that we are involved in. We can see just recently with the conclave in Rome and with the election of Pope Leo that there were a wide variety of clothes worn by the cardinals and bishops and archbishops, and then by the Pope himself, who's the only one who gets to wear all white, identifying him and separating him from the rest of the group as someone who is really important and who has a lot of authority. These different kinds of clothing can tell us something about who someone is. As I mentioned earlier, we can look at somebody in their clothes and say, oh, this person is important, or this person has a lot of money, this person is honest and just. Or we can also see clothes as a kind of disguise or masquerade. You know, there's probably nothing worse than someone who really tries to hide who they really are by clothing which gives the wrong impression or which tries to deceive people. You can think of a couple cases recently in which there were serious crimes committed by people who were dressed up as police officers to give others the impression that they had this police authority and that they were going to fix a problem or be helpful to people, when in fact what they were bent upon was destruction. And I raise these questions about clothing because the scriptures often talk about clothing. You can think of Joseph's magnificent coat in the Hebrew scriptures. And in today's readings in the letter to the Colossians, we see language about putting on Christ or putting on a new self. And this language of clothing ourselves with Christ or assuming Christ himself as who we are is a kind of language that we find very often in the scriptures. And when St. Paul uses this when he speaks to the Colossians, he really wants to tell them to avoid duplicity and to avoid that kind of trying to make a false impression, to give people the wrong idea. And just like in other situations in life, we can use our clothes to try to pretend to be somebody we're not. And in this situation with the Colossians, St. Paul is really saying to people, you know, you've perhaps lived a life of vice, a life of selfishness, but now is the time for you to put on Christ. And it doesn't mean putting on Christ like you put on a new shirt, which then you can take off, but put on Christ, put on the clothing of Christ, and conform your inner self to it. And I think that relates to the Hebrew scriptures today, which talks about vanity of vanities, in which people are advised not to pile up riches thinking that these are going to last. This is all vanity, says Qoheleth. And in a similar way, Paul is urging the Colossians to put off or to take off that old self and to put on this new clothing of Christ, but then to live as though you are wearing it, so that it's not an illusion, so that it's not just a trick or a deception, but that who we are is really reflected in both our outer vesture and in terms of our inner selves. There are a few remnants in our liturgical life about how we, do this every day. For instance, we often at Easter season refer to people getting all dressed up in their Easter bonnets. Well, everyone knows that those bonnets were temporary. They can come on and come off, but they were a recognition of the importance of this day, that we make ourselves beautiful and we dress up in order to reflect the beauty and the glory of that Easter celebration. Or we also, sometimes we remember that when kids make their first communion, the young boys are all dressed up, usually in white shirts and ties. The girls wear white dresses. Again, they are trying in a very basic way, maybe a superficial way, to say that they are, in receiving the Lord the first time, putting on Christ, that they are becoming Christ-like, and yet it is only in the fullness of their lives that it will become clear to them what this really means. That this is the Christian life. Putting on Christ is not just something that you take off and put back on again. It's something that has to become who we are so that we never feel self-conscious or embarrassed or ashamed about what we're trying to say when our inner selves don't reflect it. Now, there's a certain irony here, I think, in the fact that I'm standing here talking about clothes when I'm all dressed in white. And I want to assure you that I'm not trying to tell you that I'm sinless, but I am trying to say, and we are all trying to say by our religious garb, that we at least are trying to put on Christ, and that every time I put on this habit, I remind myself that in my baptism, I started to put on Christ, and that I've been working at it my whole life. So today, as we hear this reading from Colossians, let's ask God to help us be aware of who we would like to be, of who we have become, and especially of what we try to convey to others in our external clothing or our behavior, if we indeed aspire to put on Christ and to become other Christs to those around us.